much more tolerant in elastic positions, not the fundamentalist piety that you see today. And by the way, algebra is an Arabic word. Did you know that? Mm-hmm. Algebra. I'm in an Arabic classroom, so I feel at home. I spend most of my time dealing with the Arabic-speaking world. Let's take a closer look at the Turkish state now. And this is an exciting time for you guys to be going to Turkey. History is in the making. A year and a half ago, on July 29th, the Ataturk era, which had dominated Turkish national life for nearly a century, there he is, came to an end. And that's the day when Turkey's 4 top military officers handed in their resignations to Erdogan. The resignations followed yet another AKP victory at the polls just a month before, in June 2011. Turkey's ruling party won a 3rd consecutive election victory, and they won almost 50% support in that election. 47% in the election in 2007, with about 87% turnout from the electorate. So a very solid win. In spite of his shrinking popularity, Erdogan is still in a very strong position. So he's become the first Turkish leader in the history of modern Turkey, not only to win 3 consecutive elections, but to increase his party's share of the vote each time. The government's 9-year record of strong economic growth, averaging around 8%, just a percentage point shy of China's a year ago, improved social services, unprecedented stability, in spite of the problems to the south. Turkey is a very big country. Overshadowed growing concerns at Erdogan's authoritarian and autocratic tendencies. Constitutional lawyer Noah Feldman, who teaches at Harvard, asked a big question about Erdogan, and it's a question that remains. And I'd like you to think about it before you go on the trip and while you're out there too. Is he dedicated to his party's plans for comprehensive constitutional reform, or is he simply serving the interests of religion? Again, there's this sort of duality in Turkish politics, the bipolar nature, state versus religion. Now, as I've hinted at a couple of times in this talk already, AKP's strong showing also reflects the rise of a long repressed class of conservative Sunni Muslim Anatolians, people who live out in the West. Anatolia, an old Greek word which means where the sun rises. Okay? Very, very different kind of thinking out there. Some would call Anatolia the Texas, Turkey's Texas. Much more conservative, much more pious. You have to put what I'm saying about the changes in Turkey into context. Probably the pendulum was due to swing back some part of the way from this extreme secularism that Ataturk set up in a very autocratic way, which only began to come to an end when Erdogan came to power. These coups by the army, 1960, 71, 1980, 1997, the first of which resulted in the hanging of a Turkish prime minister by the army because they thought he was being too soft on Islamists, or too sympathetic to Islamists. This extreme secularism was bound to be challenged at some point by more pious Turks. the problems with figuring out the roles of state and religion in Turkey involve the Armenians, of course, as well. There's some good material, brief material in Kinzer about the Armenian problem. Have you talked about that? Okay. This Armenian activist was assassinated in 2007, and it was really the first time that that Turks began to suspect that that the same forces that pulled off those army coups 4 times were beginning to work in much more subtle, behind-the-scenes fashion within an invisible sphere which Turks call Dream Devlet, or deep state. I have a slide with this term on it. It'll come up in a minute. But the fact that the assassin was a Turkish nationalist, a sympathizer of the army and secularism, began to raise a lot of concerns about this behind-the-scenes action. And gradually, over the course of the year 2007, 2008, it began to become much more visible in the Ergenekon trial. This is an extremist nationalist group. It's probably not too far off to say that they're politically speaking, in their right-wing predilections, they resemble the American Nazi Party, for example. They have been associated with assassinations, and they've been known to beat up journalists and others who they suspect may be Muslim sympathizers. The name Ergenekon comes from a fairy tale valley in Central Asia, a mythical valley. There are different versions of the myth, but they all share the same theme of how a she-wolf, sort of akin to Rome, being created by the she-wolf, rescuing the twins Romulus and Remus. How a she-wolf rescued the Turkish nation from its enemies. And this fits in perfectly with, some think, with the mentality of Turks vis-a-vis strangers. Turkey is surrounded by 8 hostile neighbors. Kinzer makes this point early in the book. And so Turks historically have always been looking for enemies under the carpet or under the bed. And some of these people, some of these paranoid types are making up the ranks of the Ergenekon. And in this case, they suspect that the enemies are the Islamists. So for supporters of Ergenekon, the myth has become historical precedent. The 4 times the military stepped in to rescue the nation from falling off the path of secular politics. The whole thing started, the Ergenekon group began to really come on the radar in June 2007 when a cache of grenades was found in a house in Istanbul. And about 300 people were rounded up. They began to make connections with other deep state activity, and Kinzer writes about some of this, which is one of my favorite parts of the book, in a perverse kind of way, I guess. The Susurluk incident. Do you remember this? The car crash, and in 1996, November 3rd, 1996, in the city of Susurluk. A car crash took place, and it sent shock waves across the nation. Now, how come? Well, it had to do with who was in the car. The 4 occupants of the car that night should not have been riding together in that car. They shouldn't have been there in the first place, unless they were up to no good. There were 3 men and 1 woman. One of the men was a top-ranked police commander named Hüseyin Gıdagin, who had led operations against Kurdish rebels. But unbelievably, in the seat next to him was a Kurdish clan leader named Sedat Bujak, who was also a Turkish MP and head of a private army hired out to the Turkish government forces to fight Kurdish nationalism. So there are some tentacles here, some suspicious connections. It gets better. It gets better. The back seat was one of the country's most notorious gangsters, a guy named Abdullah Chath, who also happened to be an ultra-right nationalist. And for good measure, he also trafficked in drugs. And seated next to him was his mistress, a former beauty queen. Bujak, the Kurdish nationalist leader, was the only one of the four who survived. But curiously, he developed amnesia and could not tell the authorities what they were all doing together in that car. But once it began to get publicity, began to develop, began to alert Turks that something on the level of deep state was going on here. Secret government operations, sort of like Oliver North in the Irangate scandal. Irene Devlet, deep state. It was the Sasurlik scandal and others a decade later that started to dramatically shift the prevalent paradigms. Another one was the Shemdinli incident. Shemdinli is a town very near the Iranian border. On November 9th, 2005, a bomb went off in a bookstore there. The owner of the store was a Kurd, a convicted member of the PKK, who'd been in jail for 15 years. The suspects in the attack turned out to be low-ranking members of the Turkish secret police. So again, suspicions about the deep state activity pervaded. This trial was still going on this fall. I'm beginning to run late, so I'm going to skip some other material here and go right to the updated trial. There was a resolution of sorts this past fall when on September 21st, an Istanbul security court handed down sentences ranging from 6 to 20 years against 325 officers accused of seeking to overthrow Prime Minister Erdogan and the AKP, Justice and Development Party. So the game is still being played out. There's more we can say about this, but I want to talk a little bit more about this group I alluded to at the beginning of the talk, because some suspect that there is a growing Islamist deep state as well to counter the Ergenekon types, a leftist. Actually, left and right really don't work here. Let's just call it Islamist versus secular. Yeah. The leader of this group is Fethullah Gulen. His title is Hoj Effendi, or Master Lord. He went into self-imposed exile because he feared persecution by the secularist Irene Devlet, deep state types, in 1999. He's living in Saylorsburg, PA, in the Pocono Mountains. It's a little commune up there. And he works from exile to counter the influence of the secular deep state, Ergenekon type forces. What's interesting about all this is that you would think that he would be a natural ally of Erdogan, but unfortunately there's a personality clash here. These two are both very authoritarian types, autocratic types, and they don't get along very well. So they're not easy allies. There's also been secular resistance to the army. It's not a clear-cut case of all the secularists on one side and all the Islamists on the other. The secularists also have a record of opposing army initiatives. Menderes, actually, the guy who was hanged in 1961, was himself a secularist, but he was thought to be too much of a sympathizer of Muslims, and that cost him his life. Also had better luck, Turgot doesn't. And some of his ways of resisting army influence involved showing up at military parades dressed as he and his wife had just come from the beach. In other words, not showing very much respect for the army and their uniforms and so forth. Let's talk a little bit about history now. Having gotten a taste of what's going on in Turkey's present, I'm going to skip over quite a bit of this material because we're running short on time, and I want to make sure there's plenty of time to have a discussion. We'll come back to some of it if we do have time. Let's try to get some clues from Turkey's past, get a sense of why Turkey is how we find it today. Robert Kaplan has a new book out, and in it he argues that geography determines history. Now, in our day and age, deterministic theories of history are suspect, but Kaplan makes a compelling case. Again, Turkey's location as a bridge between East and West, or West and East, between Europe and Asia, going all the way back to ancient times, the Persian Wars particularly. Leaves some room for what Kaplan is saying, I think, as well as what we've mentioned already, that Turkey is surrounded by hostile neighbors, and hostility tends to encourage, if not determine, hostile feelings towards one's enemy and the tendency to look for enemies under the bed. There's again the East-West tensions you find in Turkey, the Christian versus Islamic tensions that go all the way back to ancient times, and some of this is evident in the ancient and the medieval literature. Take just one example. Here again is the map. West versus East. Is Turkey part of Europe? Is it part of Asia? These are all the questions that you should be asking. Historic enemies all around it: the Russians, the Armenians, the Arabs, the Iranians. Goes on and on. Take just one example of evidence from literature of all this. One of the most poignant, I think, is the Digenis Acritas tradition. It goes back to the 11th century. Comes from the region of what we now call Turkey. The tale actually may go back even earlier, to the 8th century. That is in the early centuries of the Islamic Empire. It tells of a mixed breed hero named Basil Digenes. This is an eponym. The word in Greek means two peoples, indicating his mixed breed status. Product of the union of an Arab Muslim and a Greek Christian princess, who the Arab emir of Basil's father abducts and later marries. He ends up converting from Islam to Christianity. That's a story you don't hear very much, for her sake. And they settle in Romania, where Basil grows up in this story. The boy Basil has a second eponym, Acritas. This is a piece of medieval crockery which shows as a portrait of Basil. Acritas means in Greek one roughly border dweller, one who dwells on the border between two places. It was the title of Byzantine guards who stood guard duty on the border between the Byzantine Empire and the Muslim Empire. So if you get the picture here, we're talking about an individual who is of mixed origins, dwelling on the border, and who goes back and forth with relative alacrity, with relative ease. He's got his foot in both camps at the same time, certainly in one point and the other. And many think that this is the tale that inspired the S.I.T cycle in Spanish literature. Anybody take Spanish or know of the S.I.T? There's a lot of Arabic in Spanish, and Seed comes from the Arabic word Sayyid, which means master. And El Cid, like Basil Acrates, fought on both sides, the Muslim side and the Christian side, in the Iberian Peninsula. So there is strong literary evidence for this kind of bipolar nature in the Ottoman and later Turkish psyche. Now, the Ottoman Empire, of course, was founded by S.I.T, which means conqueror. Mehmet was his real name. If you, I don't know whether S.I.T's tomb is on your itinerary. It's just west of Sultan Ahmed, a short bus ride. It's worth going there. It'll get you into a more conservative part of town. You'll see a lot more veils there. But in spite of the portrait here, you see him sniffing a flower. He was a very ruthless character. He didn't want to get on his bad side. But he rededicates or reconsecrates the Hagia Sophia, Saint Sophie, the old Byzantine church. Reconsecrates it as a mosque and puts up 4 minarets, which you will see. This is Sultan Ahmed. They'll spend the better part of the day there, probably. Mm-hmm. The Blue Mosque is roughly where the photographer is standing, and the Topkapi Palace is behind the Hagia Sophia. What's that called? The Hagia Sophia. So all these areas all these monuments are within a very short walk of one another. You're looking across the Bosphorus, the Asian side there. Now, the Ottoman period officially runs between 1517 and 1918. And what's interesting about the empire is that almost immediately after it comes together, it starts falling apart. And people start, within a century or two, calling the Ottomans the second hand of Europe. That's a little extreme. More objective histories talk about decline, or perhaps even more benevolently, decentralization. The empire becomes more and more decentralized. A little bit more loosey-goosey. This process of decentralization or decline begins with a battle off the coast of Greece at a place called Lepanto, right here, at the mouth of the Gulf of Patras. A naval battle between the Holy League under the command of John of Austria and the Ottoman fleet under the command of Uluj Ali Pasha. And the Ottoman fleet was almost completely wiped out. Interestingly, one of the people fighting on the Christian side was the Spanish writer Cervantes, who lost the use of his left arm in that battle. This was the first major defeat of the Ottomans by, and get this, it's important, by a Christian force. Which religion did the Ottomans practice? Islam, okay. Mm-hmm. Well, in Islamic ideology, this isn't supposed to happen. That's right. Islam, from the very beginning, sets itself up as the final religion, the final time that God ever will speak to human beings, is in the Quran. Muhammad's title is many titles, but one of the most prominent ones is in Arabic is Khatim an-Nabiyyin, the seal of the prophets. He's not the only prophet. There's Jesus and Abraham and Moses and all the rest, but he's the seal of the prophets. He's the last one God will ever send to human beings. No more. Okay? The Quran is the last word. So how can Muslims lose to Christians? And this is only the beginning. So what you see starting here is a psychological crisis that gets worse and worse. The Ottoman sieges of Vienna, 1529, 1531, and the final one in 1683. The Ottomans failed to take Vienna. I'll come back to this. This might be interesting to talk about the conflicting ideologies between Muslims and Christians. But in 1699, the Battle of Zenta on the east side of the Tisza River in Serbia. Again, the Ottomans lose, and the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, they give up lands to the Christian Habsburgs. They were forced to give up many of the Central European territories, including Hungary. All of Hungary is lost. And then the next group they do battle with is the Russians. The Russo-Ottoman War, which ends in 1774 with the Treaty of Kujik-Kanarja, located in northeastern Bulgaria. This is the battle that opened the Turkish Straits to Russia. Historic enemies, Russia and the Turks, Christian Russians, Orthodox Russians, Muslim Turks. Okay. By the way, this is a European-Oriental conflict too, Oriental Asia. Europeans, Turks are descendants of the Mongols, or a tribe related to the Mongols. So there's a racial component to all of this as well. And beginning in 1774 then, and really it took them 200 years to finally admit that something was seriously wrong. That they keep losing to these Christians. So a period of introspection sets in, and then reform. And this is the process that eventually leads to Ataturk. And the answer that the Turks are going to arrive at eventually is Islam is not doing it for us. We need to find a different way. And the different way it's going to turn out to be is modernism. And modernism as introduced to us by the Christian West. And also the Enlightenment West. Ataturk was a great follower of the French Enlightenment figures, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and so forth. So the psychological component of all this is interesting too. What do you do when your religion says you're on the winning side? You follow the seal of the prophets and all the rest. But your history for the past 1,000 years says you're a loser. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. And you can't live with cognitive dissonance. You've got to figure out a way to resolve it. And there are many ways to resolve cognitive dissonance. Denial, anger, and some of these run together too, don't they? Nostalgia or regression. We're seeing some of this in Salafist thinking in the Arab revolutions. Longing for the perfect time, the 7th century, when everything was bliss and happiness under the rule of the Prophet Muhammad, 7th century Medina. Okay? Nothing wrong. Perfect. This is the Garden of Eden. Islam's Garden of Eden is 7th century Medina under the rule of the seal of the prophets. Revivalism, including renewed calls for jihad. Blame. Okay, it's all the fault of the colonialists, the British and the French and the Americans. Okay? Or reform. Many would say that the Arabs are still all stuck in these yellow responses. Only the Turks seem to have arrived at the conclusion that we're doing something wrong here. We need to fix it. Stop blaming others. Bernard Lewis, who is a historian emeritus at Princeton, authored many books, and got his start studying the Turks, fluent in Turkish. Many of his early books, still one of the best books on the history of Turkey. It's the one he wrote back in the 30s. The guy's up in his 90s now, he's still writing. Let me go back to him and just read a quote, if I can do it. Yeah. when things go wrong in a society, in a way to a degree that that no longer can be denied or concealed, there are various questions that one can ask. A common one, particularly in continental Europe yesterday and in the Middle East today, is who did this to us? The answer to a question thus formulated is usually to place the blame on external or domestic scapegoats, foreigners abroad or minorities at home. The Ottomans, faced with the major crisis in their history, asked a different question. What did we do wrong? Or what are we doing wrong? See the difference? So this begins to lead to a series of reforms that take a century or two to take shape. Selim III was the first to really get it going with a reform of the army. He entitled his movement the Nizam al-Jadid. That's an Arabic phrase. Yeah. Turkish is borrowed. Nizam means regime, in Arabic. Jadid means new. The new regime, the new way of doing things. In 1826, Mahmud II succeeded him as Sultan, succeeded Selim, eliminated the Janissary Corps. These were fiercely devout, pious Muslim soldiers. They were massacred just outside the Blue Mosque. And to this day, the Janissaries have played only a ceremonial role, but a pretty darn good one. If you get a chance, you go to the Turkish Military Museum. Did you do that? And hear the Janissary band?
The Janissary band, I played this music for them the last time we had class. We saw them in action.
You did see them?
I did.
Good. But at the Turkish Military Museum? Or?
No, they had, the mayor had them come in and do a special.
Don't miss it. I mean, the myth is that the Ottomans' enemies could be subdued just by hearing the Janissary military band play.
I think they were just so loud.
Drums. And the martial bands of Europe took their cues from the Janissary band. This is a tradition. Having bands march soldiers into battle is something they borrowed from Janissaries. But as a palace Praetorian guard, they were done after 1826. So this is another key step along the path towards secularization. The army becomes secularized, or is beginning to become secularized. The Peace of Adrianople, the Turks, the Ottomans lose Greece. They gain their independence from the Greeks gain their independence from the Ottomans. So again, decline or decentralization. Another period of reform sets in just after this, under Abdul-Mejid, the Tanzimat, or reorganization. All aspects of society, not just the military now, but the reforms of state institutions, the bureaucracy. This leads to the formation of more secularist inclined groups like the Young Ottomans. A liberal constitution is put into place under Midhat Pasha, and the Young Ottomans yield to the Young Turks in 1889. So the term Turk is beginning to come into parlance. 1908, there's a constitutional revolution orchestrated by the Young Turks, who now call themselves the Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP for short. They are forced out by the army, but then in 1913, a year later, they stage a coup, come back. So there's tremendous ferment in the Turkish institutions of state, between the political and the military. One of my favorite Ottoman expressions is the sublime porte. This is what they called the seat of the Sultan. Broadly, it means the Ottoman state. But you should know that the sublime porte actually is a port or a gate, and you'll walk right by it if you walk down the hill from the Topkapi Palace down toward the water and the harbor. You'll look for it on the left, right across the street from the Topkapi Palace. It's now the governor's residence, but it was a real place, not just what the Ottoman Empire called Istanbul. Enver Pasha was the leader of the coup. Enver Pasha goes on to be nicknamed the father of the modern Middle East by at least one author, David Franken, because at the age of 31, it was Enver who committed the Ottomans to the losing side of World War I. The Ottomans did not need to enter that war. They had no serious political interest in doing so, besides the fact they were friendly with the Germans. They could have stayed out of it, but they didn't. And by aligning themselves with the losing side, they sealed the fate of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire falls into the hands of which two dominant powers after World War I? Do you remember? No? Can you guess? Educated guessing is a good way to get it into.
Probably the British.
The British, and to a lesser extent, across the channel from the British, the French and the British. These are the two powers that colonize the former Ottoman states and are responsible in large measure for the chaos that still reigns. By creating a divide and conquer approach to the Middle East, especially the Arab countries, the British and the French play a large role in what's going on now. You can't blame them for all the denial and the regression and anger that you see among Arabs. But certainly you can see here a different approach from what the Turks took versus what Arabs in the Middle East are taking. Maybe the Arabs are finally starting to get things going, but there's an awful lot